Greetings. Amelia has kindly asked me to answer a few questions, and the first one is to say something about myself. That's always a tricky one for me, as it's difficult to know which audience I'm responding to and which aspect of myself to express because of my checkered career in so many different occupations. I originally come from the middle of England, Shakespeare's country, but I've lived in many other lands as a world-travelling adventurer. After studying for 3 years in art college, I began my career as a surrealist painter, having been very influenced by Salvador Dali, with whom I later became friendly when I specifically went to live near him on the Costa Brava in Spain. I also spent many years in show business as a scenic artist and costume designer for variety spectaculars and drama in many countries, and also as an actor on stage and in film as a stuntman. I travelled by thumb to Israel, where I worked for a year doing all kinds of jobs, and then took a boat to Cyprus, where I had an unexpected mystical experience known as cosmic consciousness, which expanded my awareness out into the universe and gifted me with spiritual knowledge, which changed the whole course of my life, and which is why I have the cosmos behind me. This event and other mystical experiences caused me to be invited as an international speaker in conferences around the world. After working as an art director for Egyptian television for 6 months, I then hitchhiked dangerously down the whole length of Africa, escaping death on a number of occasions, and I ended up working in showbiz and films in South Africa for a couple of years. When I returned to the UK, having lost all interest in a career, I went to work for the BBC, painting background scenery for their productions and earning enough to begin something closer to my heart. I left the Beeb to create a mystical community and a magazine called Gandalf's Garden, with the approval of Tolkien himself, I might add, which I ran for the next 3 years in London, and we became famous all over the world. There I invited gurus and spiritual teachers from every part of the world to lecture and teach. After that, it took me 7 months to hitchhike to India, where I spent 3 years as a wandering monk, studying with masters of many different spiritual traditions and specializing in Mantra Yoga. On my return to England, I studied psychotherapy and became a therapist, setting up Spiritualized Therapy Centre in London and a private practice in the country. So with all that, you can imagine my books are a blend of psychotherapy and practical spiritual self-help techniques, everything based on my own actual experience. Next question is, what made you write your books? Well, besides my artistic capacities, I think being a writer was born into me even as a child. I was devoted to books, and I even made up little facsimile books of my own, faithfully adding metadata and copyright symbol and everything. So I guess the urge to be a writer developed at a very early age. I remember writing stories from the age of 7. What is the first book you remember reading? Is the next question. Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I have just published my updated rewrite of the very first book that captured my imagination when I was 6 years old. It was called Old Mother Westwind, Short Bedtime Stories about the adventures and mischiefs of the creatures of the meadow and wood. And I still remembered that book when I became an adult. However, I was never able to find a copy anywhere in England, and nobody had ever heard of it. It wasn't until I was 80 years old that I thought of putting the book title on the internet, and lo and behold, to my delight, I discovered it was an ancient American classics that kids grew up with over 100 years ago. But then, to my great disappointment, I found it so old-fashioned and so poorly written by today's standards that, on discovering that it was out of copyright, I decided to rewrite and revitalize it for today's parents and children while still retaining the charm of the original. So I took a year off of unpaid work to rewrite and re-illustrate this book as a labour of love in order to introduce it to British children. Next question, what's your favourite book? Well, following the second book, which coloured my childhood imagination ever after, being The Hobbit, it has to be Lord of the Rings, which I have read every winter for the past 60 years. I never get tired of it. So, of course, the answer to your next question, who is your favourite author and why, has to be Tolkien, because of his breadth of imagination, narrative style, and literary skill. But I also adore Robin Hood's fantasy books, Ursula Le Guin, and other children's writers like C.S. Lewis, Tove Jansson, and her Moomin books, Kenneth Grahame, A.A. Milne, and the like. How many hours a day do I write? Too many when I'm inspired, too little when I'm not. But I'm usually on the computer at least 10 ridiculous hours a day doing donkey work, even if I'm not creating. What thing would I give up to be a better writer? That's easy. Procrastination. I'm an expert at it. What is the most difficult part of my artistic process? I think deciding I need to cut out sections that I've worked hard on when I feel it may be slowing up the story, or in a non-fictional book when I think it may be losing the reader's interest. Otherwise, it's the techie stuff, like formatting or learning how to create promotional artwork in a graphic program. What do I need in my writing space to help me stay focused? Total silence and a pot full of exotic mango tea laced with honey, ginger and mint. Do I listen to music when I write? No, I don't. I tried it because other authors claimed it helped them, but I find it too distracting and takes my concentration away from what I'm working on. Where do I get my ideas for my books? Well, they're usually born out of necessity. My first book, Seeking the Master, a guide to the ashrams of India and Nepal, jokingly known as the 5-star Guru Guide, came about because hordes of hippies and backpacking seekers were off on the Guru hunting trail to India. And as I spent 3 years as a wandering monk there, I had unique knowledge of well over 300 gurus and ashrams. My second book, Ifilpin Island, a children's fantasy, began just because I doodled a few funny characters in the Moomin style and I wanted to write a story about them. I had no idea of a plot, so I just started writing about the characters until a story gradually emerged and I eventually found out what the book was about. My spiritual self-help books, Sharing the Quest, Secrets of Self-Understanding, and You Are the Light, Secrets of the Sages Made Simple, came from the questions I was asked when I was writing a kind of spiritual agony aunt column in a British yoga magazine, and later questions I got from my students when I was leading Mantra Yoga workshops around the world. Do you try to be more original or rather give readers what they want? It's more of a balancing act for me. Firstly, I write for myself, and I write what needs to be written and what nobody else is writing. My spiritual self-help books, I write from my own experience, not from the study of other books. So that automatically gives readers what they want, authenticity. And practical methods of development I learned in the spiritual trenches, as it were, that will really help them in life. For my children's books, I write in an original, quirky, lyrical style that no one else is using, which both adults and children find charming and a delight to read aloud. What kind of research do I do, and how long do I spend researching before beginning a book? That depends on what type of book I'm writing. For the kids' books, I don't need much research, unless it is to make sure I have the animals behave according to their natural characteristics. But for the serious books, I make sure to research all the facts so that everything I talk about is accurate. And for my autobiographical memoir, which is years in the coming, I look up dates and places as and when I remember the incidents I want to write about. What part of the book was the most fun to write? Which book are we talking about here? For the children's books, the funny parts are the most enjoyable. For the self-help books, it's when I'm explaining mystical experience in a way that nobody else has done, or where I'm able to clarify spiritual problems that everyone has in a way that anyone can grasp. For my memoir, it's the dangerous and exciting situations I found myself in during my travels that are the most fun to write, which is why the media calls me the Indiana Jones of yoga. How do I come up with the titles for my books? Well, I usually play with a dozen or so until one sticks, or I ask my following which one they would prefer. It's great if you can have a title before you start, as that helps to keep you on track while writing. Would you and your main character get along? Well, sure I would, or I wouldn't have invented them. Which of the characters in your books do you relate to the most and why? I naturally relate to the hero, as there are always aspects of myself in him, but I also bond with the endearing and sympathetic secondary characters. In Old Mother West Wind Tales, I'm very fond of Johnny Chuck the Groundhog because of his amiable nature and the slightly pompous grandfather frog who advises about vanity while still being a trifle susceptible to it himself. And I love the new character I invented, Little Zoe Otter, who is plucky and resourceful and a great role model for little girls who love her to bits. What is the significant way my book has changed since the first draft? Well, the first draft is always crap, although in the fever of creativity we think it is wonderful. But put it aside for a month or two and then come back to it and look at it objectively. Then you'll see how much needs editing. After extensive rewrites and editing, my books are always tighter and more readable than the original version. How would I describe my ideal reader? My ideal reader is the one who adores my books, and judging by the fact that I only ever get 5-star reviews, that seems to be all of them, from every walk of life. How long did it take you to write a book? It took me 3 years to write up everything for Seeking the Master, my guide to the gurus and ashrams of India and Nepal, corresponding with ashrams to make sure I got my facts right, but it's now well out of date as all the gurus I wrote about have inconveniently gone and died. And Ifilpin Island was 60 years in the writing, in between earning a living and travelling and working in many countries. My spiritual books took about 3 years each, and Old Mother West Wind Tales was just over 1 year, including all the illustrations, because I already had what I call the bare bones of a book that I was able to flesh out and make more attractive. What do I hope readers will take away from my books? For the children's books, I hope they'll come away with a heart full of comfort and satisfaction and a wish to read the stories all over again. For the spiritual self-help books, so many readers have said the books blew their minds and changed their lives, so I couldn't ask for more. How did I feel when I published my first book? Like a pregnant woman must feel when she's finally birthed her baby, elated, relieved, and exhausted. But it's a magic moment for every author when they hold their first published book baby in their hands after months or maybe years of gestation. Where can people who are interested in your books buy them? Well, as usual, they can find them on all the Amazon sites, as well as Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Smashwords, and it can be ordered from any bookshop. And for anyone living in the UK, they can get it direct from my website, www.muzmurray.com, and they'll get it even quicker than from Amazon. Am I working on anything at present that I'd like to share with my readers? Well, I'm presently working on promotions, but I dip into my memoir now and again when time allows, in between constant bouts of computer confustications and bureaucratic botherations. After writing my books, what is my advice to people who want to become writers? Firstly, be prepared for heartache, especially if you want to become traditionally published. One way or another, I was screwed over by traditional publishers and finally discovered independent publishing. So now I'm a full-time indie and publish my own books. Secondly, if you choose the self-publishing route, it can be done on a shoestring, but you will really need to put aside a fair amount of cash for formatting, editing, and promotions. Otherwise, your book is unlikely to get off the ground without that, or off the shelf. But at least you will have control of your book design, the cover you want, the way you want to write and express yourself, and way, way better royalties. It may be a long, hard slog, but don't be disheartened. Keep on writing and you'll find it's worth it in the end. If you'd like to explore my work further, you can find about 60 or more of my spiritual teaching videos on YouTube. Also on my Muz Murray's Inner Garden page on Facebook. On my website, You may find a lot of interesting things to check out. Anyway, thanks for watching.